is that one?
I don't know. And I think our listeners wonder too. All of a sudden, well, first of all, welcome to the Regeneration Podcast. You kind of caught us in mid-conversation, but for those listening, especially to the YouTube, the lady's voice that says you're recording used to start, and then YouTube would start recording. Now it starts recording and we hear the lady's voice. I think she's looking for stardom, right? She's getting her voice out there and name.
I hate droids, but anyway.
Okay. But again, welcome to the Regeneration Podcast. We have a returning guest, one of our most popular. And because you'll hear his accent, and even though last time we had him on, he's of Irish descent. And so when we set up this Zoom call, I used the wrong time zone. So our guest this morning, James Tunney, he lives in Sweden. And so thank you, James, for your patience in me giving you 5 hours away when it's actually 6 hours away. And want to let people know that we've got a couple of subjects that we're blessed to be talking with James about this morning. And I'm really honored to think that he had listened to our previous series on the machine, the beehive, the hypnostructure. And James, before we signed on, said he'd like to weigh in a little bit. And that's perfect, because I was thinking I'd want his opinion on this too. So James, begin. Go at it any which way you like. Something you heard that you want to react to, or just kind of like your bold own initiative on this vision of the world.
Yeah, just to, because I think any discourse or dialogue has to be a growing open thing, as opposed to just some tessellated mosaic of opinions. So in the last book I wrote, the recent book, which is kind of 800 pages, which the plantation of the automatons, it's about the machine. So what I seek to do in that is to show from a historical context my view of what you've referred to as the machine. Of course, Paul referred to the machine, and as suggested, that goes back to Tolkien, E.M. Forster, The Machine, 1906, and a lot of others. And also into the idea of man as machine, going back to 747, the Lemaitrier. So there's a number of different ways we have to think about it. So I tend to think about it on a micro level in relation to the human as a machine, or the conception of the human as a machine. The medium level in relation to social factors and media, and then the macro level. And in that context, that's the issue of global governance. Mm-hmm. So I've sought to explain how what's happening now is that we're going through a change of state. The World Economic Forum call it the state of the world, which has two meanings. The state of the world, it refers to that which is outside artificial intelligence, and refers to a global state. So that implies the breakdown of the United States, national sovereignty, and also the implications for the micro element for us in this new governance system, which of course is the transhumanist context. So we're moving into, so state is very important, and the idea of change of state, and consistent with what Guido was talking about, of course, John Kenneth Galbraith in 1967, the new industrial state and technostructure. So we're all familiar, and I agree with the thrust of the critiques presented. So I just want to add to that. In the feature of the future of governance is the machine of government, as was described in the 19th century by a Jesuit, I think. And there's a funny element in this as well, in that I've posited this shift in relation to humans and human interaction with the machine as a shift of us to the automaton state. And there's an interesting complication, I suppose, in the historical evolution, in that the body that was most concerned with automata for a long time in Europe was the Catholic Church. And people forget about this, that when you went into churches, they had Jesus that moved, they had a lot of statues that were moving. You still see them in the churches in Germany when the man comes out to bang on the clock. They were the ones that had the technical skills. When the Jesuits went to China, they impressed the emperor with automata. So there's a very close connection between the great scientific tradition from which all science in Europe came from ultimately, and the machinery, which was later, after the Enlightenment, taken over There was various places where automata were represented in gardens, which is the other main motif I would emphasize. And that's where Descartes came to develop some of his ideas.
You used the word motif. What motif was it?
Sorry, the extra one of the garden.
Okay, gotcha.
The garden as well. So I've said the plantation of the automatons. The other main idea that I want to stress is that the idea of plantation is an idea that goes back to the Roman times, goes back to the Egyptians, was developed in particular to the British Empire, the Portuguese, and posited in this idea is an idea of the human as plant. And this is the thing that people don't really understand, that there was a deep idea that we are plants. And you can see this continued through imperial science or the empire of scientism, as I've said. T.H. Huxley describes plantation. The plantations in the United States were about people being planted by corporations, and the religious theme came afterwards. It just happened to be that there was people who came. It wasn't really or that there was an element of it which was independent of that. But so in the United States, the literature on plantation focuses on the very particular experience in the United States. There's an older tradition of plantation, which is associated with the plantation of people, the plantation of crops, and the altering of the natural environment to suit imperial needs, which was particularly developed in Ireland. And this idea of the human as plant was developed through eugenics, through people like Luther Burbank in the 20th century, from which all the McDonald's potatoes come from, the human as plant, where they saw the human as plant. And it's also important in relation to crystallography, as we'll see. Liquid crystals were discovered when they were researching plants because plants were important. The tobacco mosaic virus was critical in relation to virology. Modern virology comes from study of plants. So the mixture of plantation developed from an idea of the garden, a kind of mechanization of a biblical Garden of Eden sense, the material reflection of that, combined with the idea of the automaton, is the basis on which we're getting a global governance by automatic means, which aims to centralize the control of our life. The issue is not whether artificial intelligence will be conscious or not really. The issue is to what extent will the totality of our life be sucked into a machine which will govern every aspect of our life, as Philip K. Dick represented, whereby one of his characters is negotiating with payments to his door, whether his door will let him out of his apartment. So into that, so we're talking about an automatic state of the world as what we face. And part of the origins of that I place in particular in the Anglo-American tradition that follows on from in the Anglosphere,
Empire.
that follows on in particular and originates in France with the Plantagenets, that this is the real base. And in particular, when the Plantagenets mixing with the Vikings come to Britain as Normans, and they impress their system on the Anglo-Saxons. And this is a crucial point that it took me a long time to understand, although I've studied legal history, which is a forgotten element in this course, that the Normans didn't really give the legal system to the Anglo-Saxons. They built on top of it. And what the Normans became expert at was rules, in making rules and in utilizing rules to achieve their purposes. Out of that came the trust corporation, for example, which was critical. The reason why the Chinese didn't develop trading links in the Far East at the time that the East India Company did was because they didn't have any structure like the trust that could actually bring people together. So the trust is a type of legal person. So we forget about legal personhood in the context of the ideas of personhood. So the trust, which of course the basis of antitrust legislation in the United States, the basis of and trusts now effectively run the world in different form through investment companies, was a unique contribution via the British Empire with their genius for rules. Look at the basis of all the major sports, for example, from horse racing to golf to soccer to rugby. It wasn't that the British invented these, it was that they crystallized in rule forms what was meant to be done. And then when we come to the basis, the technology that's going to run the automatic machine of governance, cybernetics, it's based on utilizing rules to communicate to machines. So this genius for rules was the basis of people like Turing. It's a continuation of a strong tradition of governance. And cybernetics was designed to bring different disciplines so that they would be able to govern us better. So there's a total continuity, in my view, in relation to the development of this automatic machine, or this automatic system. And I think part of in that process, Francis Bacon is very, very important, representing the Atlanticist idea of a secret community of scientists who rule unbeknownst to people and derive their power through sea navigation, which how the British Empire evolved and developed telecommunications power that we talked about before. So I just want to put in the context of when we're talking about the machine. Now we have to begin to update it, to look ahead and to look in the crystal ball to begin to anticipate.
Let me ask you this. Now, so all the things you said so much right there. I mean,
Sorry,
farming, right? And
that was a lot.
I mean, isn't that what with farming people, right? Is that not what the Chinese is doing with the Uyghurs right now, right? They're using as organ harvesting plants, right? And I know my daughter was reading the book. What was the name of that movie and the book? It's about this boarding school where all the clones go, and when people, when the actual person needs a part, they just go to the clone and take the part out, right? Yeah. So this is already it's like it's advanced advertising in a way, right? So there's that, but there's this other part what you mentioned with Francis Bacon and New Atlantis, right, where the scientists run things, and now we know what happens when scientists run things after the last 3 years, right? But interesting with Francis Bacon, and a lot of people try to point him to this as this proto-Rosicrucian. But if you compare Francis Bacon with the original Rosicrucian documents, they're nothing alike. The Rosicrucians were we would call them traditionalists. They wanted to maintain the Christian idea of the microcosm in relationship to the macrocosm, the Christian idea of the two books, the Book of God and the Book of Nature. Francis Bacon isn't doing that at all, right?
I think those are important distinctions. Yep.
Yeah, not at all. And I think my question then, James, it seems to me, and I don't want to get too ahead of myself and not get too excited about it, but it's been nice to watch over the last couple of weeks. Part of the machine starting to short circuit. Do you think that's what's going on?
No, absolutely no.
Guido would also say no. Yeah. And I sympathize with you, Mike. Yeah, tell us, James.
No, this is a seam between a phase transition. I think it's a lot of people hope that they're seeing holes appearing in the system, but it's full steam ahead. Everything is on target. Everything is 15 to 20 steps ahead of us. This is the problem. So right. I don't see that at all. No, everything is on target. And what we may be seeing is a greater hubris because they believe they are closer to a situation where the straitjacket is finally fastened on us. Unfortunately, that's what I believe in. And again, if we look back at Bernal in The World of Flesh and the Devil, 1929, where he describes what was going to happen, that scientific corporations were going to take over the world by stealth, and they were going to we were governed by a scientific elite, and he's in the vein of H.G. Wells, etc., and Haldane, and he's Arthur C. Clarke agrees with everything he has to say.
Right.
And Bernal,
you think that's a seminal book, James?
Sorry?
The World of Flesh and the Devil.
The World of Flesh and the Devil.
A lot of people want us to kind of raise up certain books and almost pause.
This is, if you want to understand what the plans are, this is the one. he was he was a great crystallographer. So he was at the center of the studies of crystallography. So he studied water. He also, interestingly, which is relevant later on, he studied graphite, which is a critical aspect in this story, the basis of graphene, which is relevant to transhumanism. He also looked at or would have been discussing the tobacco mosaic virus, and this was the critical one in relation to virology. And of course, tobacco is a plant that the empires are always interested in. It's a premium one, and he's at the center of the study of the group that leads to DNA. So they knew that, if you remember, Schrödinger writes his essay on what is life in 42, 43 and presents his lectures in Dublin, and he anticipates that life is an aperiodic crystal. And then they kind of verify that, but they're looking at light. Crystallography, just to explain to people, really developed with the X-ray. So the X-ray allowed people to shine light, effectively, because the X-ray is light, into the crystal, to get a diffraction pattern to enable them to interpret the internal structure of crystals. So that's the critical. So we have light and crystals, which is very an important relationship in our discussion. And so Bernal is working on these things, and some of his, like Dorothy Hodgkin she worked on and developed a lot of, or studied crystals. One of her students was Margaret Thatcher, who also studied crystals. Most of the crystallographers were Marxists, and a lot of the leading ones were Marxists, which is quite interesting. And
who has a degree in crystallography is Ivan Illich. I just thought I'd bring that up early, and I wonder again, like the people implementing the machine know a lot about him, but I think one of his first graduate degrees was at the University of Florence in crystallography, Ivan Illich. So it's almost like the machine and the foes of the machine needs, and I was just, I interrupted and I apologize, but it's to let our viewers know that, we invited James to talk about crystals. So we'll be very upfront that, the conversation's going to stay on that for a little while. We segued nicely, but, so we started, James wanted to kind of weigh into the machine a little bit, the technostructure. Very grateful for that. And then we're moving, and I think we'll be working on two fronts today, but, crystallography, instead of just the pop culture thing, but there's deep ramifications here in the history of what's being implemented. And I might just take a little bit of time here to say, Michael, you said you had a story that might be a great segue here, and we'd set James singing his song.
I have a couple, but okay. Well, just so another person who was interested in crystallography, but in a very different way, was Rudolf Steiner, right? And I used to have this book. I gave it to a friend of mine years ago. I shouldn't have given it to him. Sorry, Adrian Benvenuto.
Oh, he's a
send it back.
He cribbed your book.
I haven't heard from him for decades, but anyway, he didn't write the book, but what he did is he noticed, and he brought it up to one of his biodynamic farming researchers. He said, "Do you ever notice how the ice crystals that form on the windows of the butcher shop are different than the crystals that form on the windows of the flower shop? Maybe you should check that out." And they started to research this, and so and which is interesting. It's a fascinating study. And about a lot of it leads to in the book I'm talking about, which was, I can't remember, Agriculture of Tomorrow, I think it is, that there's a real difference in the way things crystallize, say at the summer solstice than at the winter solstice, which is an important thing. But another thing, so this is something goes back when I was a Waldorf teacher, a demonstration I used to do with the kids about crystals. And a lot of people probably don't know this, but we all know that, wristwatches and other things work on crystal mechanisms, right? But you can make light with a crystal. So I would bring the kids into a dark closet, like we had this big closet for supplies, had them all sit on the floor, close the door, it was pitch black. And if you strike two crystals together, they'll start to glow. And a lot of people don't know this, I think. And it emits this really interesting odor. It's I think someone told me it's ozone. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but whatever it is, you can make light with crystals, right? So there's so much to this that we don't even know. And I think what happens is and of course, in biodynamic farming, using quartz crystal, powdered quartz crystals, is an enormously important part of the regimen of the preparations that you use on the plants. Speaking of plants, but what happens is, if you mention this subject crystals, people just get, this throwback image to the 1980s and 90s of everybody wearing crystals, right? And it's
that's
kind of
trendy again in a very big way.
psychology, superficial thing,
Yep.
right? But there's much more to it than that, and that's why I'm glad James is on the show today. So
let me, before I forget some of the points that you made there. That's right. There's a confusion about minerals and crystals. So, and also, if we go back, of course, Kepler wrote about snowflakes, and we're talking about crystals and the variety. Although there's a similarity between them, they're different. So, yeah, you talked about the piezoluminescent effect of crystals, and this can happen. It can happen with sugar and salt in your larder, for example. But in all the sites around Ireland, there were these quartz stones, and quartz is associated with a transmitter with resonance, and that's why we're communicating now. I'm not looking at you. I'm looking at a liquid crystal representation of you. We forget about crystals. All the computers depend on using crystals. And crystals, there's a book called Crystal Clear, which argues that crystals were the most significant technology in World War II. It's quite incredible. So they're of strategic importance. Historically and esoterically, they have this association with light, and this is critical. This is the association that's most important. Crystals and light, and we'll develop that. So we can make light if we express if we distort them or bash them. We have that triboluminescence in various ways to create light, and ancient people knew about this. The nature of crystals and what attracted people to them consistently, like a ruby, for example, reflects a deep awareness of possibility. For example, the ruby is used in lasers, so there's an association between things that people are attracted to and high technology. And I believe that attraction is built in some way into our makeup, that we recognize that certain things are valuable and that it's laid on the path before us once we explore them. But the other thing that, to remember is that we are crystals, and there's an argument or a description by a man called James Oshman, who says that the human is a hydrated liquid crystal. So the mixture of water and crystals. So myelin in your the nerve sheet is a liquid crystal. That's why things can happen so quickly. We have magnetite in the brain, which gives us a sense of orientation. Quartz, and that is used for orientation. Sunstone, they use that. That's probably how the monks got to the United States, how the Vikings were able to navigate on cloudy days using crystals. That's quite, and interestingly, there's an interesting connection. The origin of the word clock is disputed, but one link links it back to Columba, and I often wonder whether the connection was actually associated with stone, which is the Irish word is similar, but that's another point. Right. But crystals in the ancient world were important, so they're associated with interdimensionality. That's why you can make a radio of crystals, and they may be using that again when they cut us off, and when they break down the internet, we may be making our own radios with crystals again.
That's a happy thought, yeah.
Because they work, foxhole radios, because they work. Interdimensionality and communication with other beings. So John Dee would have used crystals to communicate with angels. H.G. Wells writes a story in 1897 called The Crystal Egg, where the man in Seven Dials in Covent Garden communicates with beings on Mars through a crystal. And this anticipates the technology. So they had an insight that these things, and probably experience that these things enabled communication with crystals. So again, the connections with the good people. I don't want to mention them again. I get into trouble with them that we talked about.
I know. That happened to me too. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't. My bath overflowed after talking to you guys last time about I don't think they were happy about us talking too much. So my bath overflowed. So I said, okay.
But they kept losing my keys for me. Yeah.
Yeah. So
But what I was going to say, so in
Yeah.
one of my first book, which is Literature and the Encounter with God in Post-Reformation England, I have a chapter on John Dee in there,
yeah,
which compares what he was doing to technology, because he was using a technology to
yes,
contact those whatever spirits those were he was talking to,
yeah,
even though he thought they were much kinder and beneficent than they were.
yeah,
But that's what it was technology.
yeah. And there's a series, I've never seen it, but I've read about it, of the Black Mirror, and the Black Mirror and in relation to technology. And I don't watch any series anymore, but
And neither do I. Yeah.
he says the Black Mirror was the front of the mobile phone, but the real Black Mirror in occult terms is the scrying stone that people like, obsidian. Yeah, he says that, but it's actually an older idea. And I'm not disputing that. That's his origin. But it's a scrying stone that they use, the obsidian, etc., to tell the future. The show stone, it's interesting, show stone, and you're watching people are watching the Black Mirror show, because there's something about communication with other dimensions. But in spiritual terms as well, the Sermon on the Mount, this is my reading of it, actually where it fits into the consistency is that, and I never could get this about ye are the salt of the earth, and then you read the various descriptions of what that means. Ye are the salt of the earth, and then it proceeds, Jesus talks about you're the light of the world. So how do those two together? Now, my belief, consistent with Swedenborg and others, is that there are different layers to to sacred texts, that there are different levels of meaning, and some of them are hidden, and some of them are for future reference. But if you take the idea that a human is a crystal, well, then ye are the salt of the earth makes extreme sense, and especially taking the view that the human is totally a hydrated liquid crystal or some other form. So ye are the salt of the earth, but you can lose your saltiness, and then you'll be just trodden underfoot. If you lose the form, the crystal form, the structure of what you are now, you can lose the capacity to be what you are in terms of transhumanism. Proceeding from there to, you are the light of the world. Now, this is, I don't know the difference between the earth and the world in that context. This is a critical distinction. And this is the main point I would put forward into this discourse, that we have a great dichotomy that helps us explain two different mindsets, consistent with your discussions before, and we've talked about in relation to, say, Ian McGilchrist, left brain, right brain. We have another distinction. We have a distinction between people who want a crystalline world, who want to project a crystal form onto the management of the world and onto humans, and others who understand that the crystal form is the container, the grail, the philosopher's stone on which the light operates, that the key thing is the light that shines through it. And that's what, so the continuation, I am the light of the world, refers to the origin of the light that comes through this process. So the crystalline mindset, for example, if you compare Teilhard de Chardin and Jacques Ellul, you get two different versions of their conception of the human. Now, I think that Teilhard de Chardin takes a crystalline view of the world, extrapolation, and associated with this mindset is a desire to put structure onto the world, and so Teilhard de Chardin's idea of removing the unpredictability is consistent with the extrapolation of a crystal view, which mistakes and obfuscates what we are. It confuses the carrier and the source, the content, which I believe
does Ellul take up specifically Teilhard in a certain book, James? You're talking about too big.
The book is the better one is Bernard Charbonneau. Now, I don't know if this is available in English, but it's called something like Teilhard de Chardin, A Prophet of Totalitarianism, and I think it was written in 1963, the key year. So Charbonneau, and there's a website for Charbonneau and his books. I'm not sure if it's available in English, but he took the Chardin on, and Ellul did as well. They were friends, and they both they both saw something in Chardin that they didn't like. I'm not a fan of the Chardin. Now, there's another word which is important, associated with crystallization, is petrification. So the process of an animal or a fossil happens in a crystal form entering into the body. And it's interesting, of course, then we have Peter, you are the rock on which we built the church. And we have this idea, well, people literally are petrified in recent fear is a type of management. And we have the debate about the structure of the church. And in that context, the church is built upon the rock, but it's not, the church is not meant to be a rock itself. The church is not meant to be that. The words are the church is built on it. So the church is something else which is built on that structure. And I think people, it's again the danger of confusing what two different things, the form of something and the content of this, and the essence of what we are, the spiritual dimension. So this distinction, I think, runs through all or through a lot of spiritual tradition. And
I hope we stay on this a little bit because it's fascinating. You know, one clarification. So, like, I'm even thinking of our listeners, James. You know, the form. Yeah. I'm going to want you to say this another way, but so is this somewhat analogous to, you know, you say the crystal, almost like worshiping the crystal as opposed to the crystal that can serve as a vehicle for light shining through? Is this like a philosophy of tools, you know, where, you know, convivial tools. So again, I'll go back to Ivan Illich, you know, tools that serve conviviality versus tools that enslave us. And let me introduce one more thing, you know, another reference. When you brought crystals into the Sermon on the Mount, there could be some literary people here, but as good in one sense as some of his novels, you know, Stendhal wrote a book called On Love. And, you know, when you're talking with college students, they all want to know about this. Freud said, greatest thing on love ever written, you know, and Stendhal was light years ahead of Freud. But his image for love was, of course, crystallization. Yes. You know, when you fall in love with somebody, you see, you know, all these crystals forming on that person, right. You know, and I'm wondering, you know, when you brought up the gospel, that came back to me, like washed all over me, that, you know, love itself can be in its best description, somewhat analogous to a crystal. Romantic love.
Yeah.
So, you know, I'm just helping, you know, I think for our listeners, you know, and Michael, you might say what you're hearing too, teasing apart what James is saying, because he's making it seminal, because we have, again, Ivan Illich, Jacques Ellul on technology, then we have Teilhard. This is really important stuff. Michael, how would you describe it, what you're hearing?
Well, I think part of it is I think these tools, I think when they come into the body, right, they change the body. And I don't know if you caught this. I wrote about it, and I did this article on transhumanism a few weeks ago for the American Mind. It's called, I think you can find it. What's it called again? It's called The Droid Stares Back. Okay. And in there, I referred to this video I saw right before I wrote this thing by Mary Harrington. I don't know if you know her.
Yeah.
She's an English, obviously of Irish ancestry, English academic, and she just came out with a book that's like a torch against feminism. And in her view, yes, transhumanism starts with the pill because it changes being. It changes what it is to be a human being, to be a woman in particular. And I think we can see right now that the full frontal attack on the human being by the transhumanists is on women, is on the female, is on Sophia, right?
I think that's very important.
And she points out, and I showed it to some students, to a couple of my classes when it came out, because I was so intrigued by it. And I asked the women, you know, because her argument is that, you know, the pill changes who you are and what you are, and you become a commodity. And I asked the girls, I said, this is your experience? Is this you know, harmonize with what your experience of the world is? And I said, you know, and I think we've all heard that women who go off the pill suddenly find they're no longer attracted to their partner, you know, because like, ooh, where'd you come from? You know, because they've been utterly changed. And I think, you know, and I have to think with what we've seen with the vaccines for the last 3 years is how I would be interested in seeing what the crystalline structure of those things is,
Graphite's going to come
actually
up for
change his
sure.
being, right?
Yeah, a few points. To the last point, latter point first. The people that worked on DNA, Crick and Watson, that were around Bernal, of course, Watson goes over to Cold Spring Harbor, and they begin to continue the work there. So the DNA begins to merge with cybernetics, which is why on September the 12th of last year, Biden issues his thing about biotech, whereby they're seeking to be able to program the human body. The barrier between the two is going, because there's no real barrier. They come from the same military industrial complex. I disagree slightly with Harrington, or I'd finesse, I think, or the point. The pill is critical as an example of prosthesis. So there's no question as an example of transhumanism. But you have to add in things beforehand which sound innocuous, but like the motor car, because some people regard the human in the motor car as analogous to a cyborg, whereby the system reduces the human. Now, it's just a different, and that's what Mumford would have talking about. So the pill as prosthesis is, now again, if you look at the 60s, it's what makes the 60s. So when, and this is where I depart again, I don't go along with McKenna in relation, because he writes his essay in, I think, 1999 about psychedelics in the information age, where he's very much in favor of prosthesis. So prosthesis at this stage, therefore, seems to be as well a big social engineering thing. So whether it be psychedelics or the pill or all the crystal meth, all the drugs which are crystal substances, which are used, LSD, they're all crystalline substances which are used to change the mind, and they often come from labs, and they're often promoted by CIA, by the deep state, etc. So there is a close thing. So to add to Harrington's view, I would say that we have to, there's a spectrum of transhumanism, which if we put at one end, say the Amish or people that used to live in Ireland 100 years ago or whatever, and at the other end, total merger, then there's a whole spectrum. And we're probably, if it's 1 to 10, we're probably at 4 now, going over into an irreversible, down the other side. We don't realize how far we've come in this. And I mean, who heard of Zoom a couple of years ago? Now we're all in the liquid crystal zoo and being dragged in and made more dependent. Of course, there's great opportunities and in the last chance saloon, but they will take them opportunities away.
The last chance saloon, I like that.
Yeah. So and interestingly, because we're talking about the dark crystal specifically, and the dark crystal, which we're going to elaborate on, comes from Jim Henson. So Jim Henson, people say the Muppets, Sesame Street, and therefore he's not taken seriously. But he was actually a very, as I've discovered, because what happened, I came to this distinction, or began to see this distinction when I'm exploring all these issues about the crystal technology, the critical nature of crystallography, the fundamental aspect. There's a sense of generalized crystallography, which actually unites all the different elements of science. And a lot of the understanding of how light behaves came about by looking at crystals and how light shines through and by refringence, etc. So it's at the basis of a lot of technology. And Jim Henson, people forget, made some famous films in the 60s. He was kind of avant-garde. He made a documentary called Youth 68. And the title is, things are going to change, or maybe they won't. It was quite ambiguous. He understood that things may not be changing. And there's a trailer you can see on YouTube where one of the guys, one of the hippies says, "Oh yeah, it's all dynamic, man, and we have to get Oedipal and kill the father." And I was thinking, yeah, that's it. That's really a brilliant statement. This is what the process in many ways was about, the crucial role of the father figure, or displacement of the father figure in this context. But Henson also made a film about called The Cube, which was a kind of Samuel Beckett type film. So he was very. He also did later the Storyteller series about fables. And he does, of course, Sesame Street and the Muppets and Fraggle Rock, which he claims to have been trying to use to promote world peace. But he was a very spiritual person. He started off as a Christian Scientist and left that, and then in the context of the counterculture was interested in Oriental thinking and Buddhism and Taoism. And then by the time he comes to write this film with a chap called Brian Froud in England, he's very much into Seth Speaks, the channeled, the Jane Roberts channeled thing, which started, I think, in 64 again, around that time, which is the critical period. So he couldn't understand some of these things, but he manifested himself in the Dark Crystal. So the Dark Crystal was a film that he wanted to make. Now, when I came to that, I went looking for a representation, and I haven't seen the film since in totality. But the idea of the film and his idea of the film accords totally with what I had come to. So in the film, if I can explain just a little bit of the structure or the synopsis of the film, that's okay? Or
yeah.
In the film, what you have is a race of people called the Urskexes, who are meant to be going home to wherever they came from, and they were an enlightened species. But there's an accident, and they're left on the planet, and then the crystal is an essential part of their governance structure, of their life, if you like. And there's an accident or a deliberate attack on the crystal, and a shard breaks off, and this splits the people in two. So we have an evil race of people. In the end, there's only 10 of them, and they manifest or represent the 7 deadly sins and the worst of humans, kind of bird-like reptilian characters, which he used based on an illustration from Alice in Wonderland or somewhere back then. So that kind of reptilian, greedy, militaristic, brutal, cruel, sadistic figures. As against that, he has the opposite group, which are the mystics, who love tradition, who are non-violent. And the story came apparently when he was snowed in with his daughter in JFK airport, and he wrote down the basis of this idea. And in one of the documentaries, they reproduce his notes. And what he did was he drew a dichotomy. On one side, the scientific mind, the rational mind, the characteristics, if you like, of a materialist mindset, focusing on militarism and science. And on the other side, the spiritual values of kindness and spirituality and imagination, etc. So, I mean, when I saw that, you could see there was this man had a deep sense of what that duality was.
He's looking at the right blueprint, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He really had a sense. So you can understand that he's coming at it from a deep level. And so there's no humans. He made the film is totally made by puppets. So there's a great level of artistry in it. But what's important, and this ties into, I think, the Sophia, the discussions about Sophia, your discussions about left brain, right brain, and for me, another description or how I'd interpret it, but you have this split. So you have a fall or a split, and the split is between these two mindsets. Mm-hmm. So the long and the short of it, without a spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen it, but we have to go to the end again on this. But in the end, the end of the film involves a prophecy, the recovery of the shard, which restores the crystal, at a stage when there's a conjunction. And there's a conjunction, as we know now, between Jupiter and Venus. Mm-hmm. There was a conjunction of their 3 suns. And if the bad guys could do a magical ceremony at this stage, well, then they would gain immortality. And this is very interesting because we get into the utilization of power to achieve immortality, the transhumanist dream. And also these bad guys, there's 2 other little races, podlings and gelflings. And these bad guys, they take the life essence out of the poor little podlings, which I think is another interesting dimension. Now, and also, I believe that Jim Henson knew a lot more about the world than his the innocent things. I think he understood about the military-industrial complex very, very well. So I think some of these stories are trying to tell us deeper things that they know about, as in, and the great book about the machine and the future. Of course, the seminal book is That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis, where he anticipates science. The university's been taken over already in 1945. They're taken over by what he called the progressive scientists. So it's not the American, it's not later on. He had it done by then. Scientific takeover, concentration, link with Satanism and link with extraterrestrials. I mean, it's all there. And he had communication with some of the people that are around Bernal, I believe, and certainly Arthur C. Clarke. But so what happens in the end of or what Jim Henson is suggesting is that the two have to join back together again. The problem is this distinction. So the problem is not just with the materialist folk. The problem, there's a critique of the mystics as well, because the mystics can't really do anything. They can do their magic ceremonies, which kind of, it made me think about the Latin Mass in some way when they saw some
of the stuff we've been talking about. Yeah.
There was, they were doing the right thing, but it didn't translate into effective force against the force that they oppose. And essentially, there's this split. And so the split in some ways reflects the loss of Sophia, or the split of the anima and the animus, which is what the painting behind me was about. That was why I stuck it up there, because I think this is a critical point, that this distinction, when in relation to Sophia and that and the contemplation of where that fits in, it also raises questions about this figure, the light-bearing figure, the hermit, the animus. And what Jung said was that in the Red Book, there's a link about the senex, or the old man, could be an old woman, and Salome. And Salome, of course, is a figure that was very important. Michael has talked about that in relation to the decadent art and symbolism. It was an important figure. And the implication from Jung is that if the relationship between the wise aspect, the wise animus, and the anima is not balanced, well, then you will get the Salome figure emerging, the destructive aspect of the anima, and you will get the weak animus emerging. So that we have to question as well, when we're looking at Sophia, what is it that's not right about the animus figure? Sorry, I went on for no. I went on too long there.
So what isn't right?
What isn't right? Okay. Two figures came to mind when I was thinking about this. Jordan Peterson and Tyson Fury. If we look at contemporary figures.
Okay, go ahead.
I mean, we can look at figures, but in the 18th century that we would know, but they don't make any sense to people in a contemporary context. I'll tell you about my premonitions about now. I can't prove this because these I didn't write down, but my wife would certainly corroborate this. When I saw Tyson Fury first, I said years ago he'll be world heavyweight boxing champion, and he'll probably be one of the greatest of all time. And I come from, my father was an Irish amateur champion. Gene Tunney, the world heavyweight champion that beat Jack Dempsey, was a distant relation. His name is James Tunney actually as well. So we were always interested in boxing. But this guy, when I saw him, I said, he's going to be world heavyweight champion. And for years and years, people said, no, we can't box. Even a lot of people that I know that are boxers, no, we can't box. I couldn't figure it out. Anyway, so he became world heavyweight champion. So I've always been interested in him. Jordan Peterson, I had two predictions about him. Again, these are not ones I was making public. Later on, or not after I heard him initially, I said the man's going to have a nervous breakdown. I'm totally sure about that.
I saw it too, clear as day. Yeah. Clear as day.
Yeah. But my first instinct, the first time I seen him, and I did communicate this again to people, was that I was convinced that this man intends to present a simulacrum of religion. That was his objective, that he was going to present a simulacrum of existing religion, which was acceptable to a globalizing secular modern world. That's what I felt about him. I still do. It's being corroborated. I haven't changed my view on that. No, again, accepting all his good points and all that and all that. I don't want to. I'm not. But just in relation to my particular thing. So, how does this in relation to the two of them? Both Tyson Fury, after being world heavyweight champion, or around the time, he also came out and talked about suicide attempts. And there's this kind of aspect that any strong male figures have to reveal some weakness, or they're not acceptable to the mainstream media. So they have to demonstrate weakness as well. I'm not saying that's not there. I'm not saying it's not authentic, but I mean, they didn't accept. He had certain political views which he had to stop communicating. But there's this kind of acceptance, of a flaw that has to be presented in order to make themselves acceptable. But the real relevant comparison came to me in relation to, Jordan Peterson's talking about God all the time. He's talking about the relation. Does he believe in God? Now, and there's the interesting thing. So when he's asked directly about does he believe in God, what does he say? Well, it depends on what you mean by do, depends on what you mean by you, depends on what you mean by believe, it depends on what you mean by God. So, okay, I understand that, but there's weasel words as well at a certain point. And his daughter had said that, they weren't allowed to go to Christian things, etc. Now, so at the same time, he's talking about all these things. He's talking about all these things as if, or he says as well, he acts as if God exists. Now, acting is another thing. As if is another thing, but that's the language of simulacrum. If we contrast that with Tyson Fury, the Tyson Fury is not an intellectual, but I believe he believes in, now I'm not saying that this is crucial to anyone's view, but in relation to the contrast, he's a very religious or spiritual person, as a lot of the Irish travelers. His father was Irish, his mother was Irish. They were moving around. But they have a very deep spiritual faith and a very genuine, that sense, which I would link with Ireland as a kind of belief system, which is kind of total non-intellectual, but it's very, very real for them. And I saw when his brother was fighting in Saudi Arabia, and the father was doing an interview and saying he was fasting over there, which was nice to hear, even though he had a criminal record and all that. He was a tough man, but he's still very, very spiritual. There's two instances. So when Tyson Fury is explaining about his mental crisis and getting help and all this, it's kind of ignored that his crucial point and where it began to change was when he said he got down on his knees and asked God for help. So that was critical. And he said George Foreman had done that as well, and he thought that it kind of registered with him. So he, despite all his mental help, the spiritual element was there. And there's a very, very interesting piece of evidence or interplay. And I don't know if you've ever seen that, if you're interested in boxing, but there's a clip on YouTube. It was an interview. I was fascinated when I saw it, between Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder. I don't know if you follow boxing at all, but
I know the names. I've seen some of it. Yeah.
So Deontay Wilder was a big American boxer, undefeated, fantastic puncher, and Tyson Fury has always been undefeated. He became world heavyweight champion, and Deontay Wilder was the best boxer available. So Fury comes over to box him in America. So now Tyson Fury is 6'9", and the other guy is 6'7" or something. So they're really powerful men. So so they fought 3 times, and I think it was the first fight, there's an interview with Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder, and they're sitting down, and then the alter ego of Deontay Wilder is the bronze bomber. So during the interview, he starts talking and saying, I'm going to beat you. You can't beat me. It's impossible to beat me. And Tyson Fury says, well, who's talking to me? Is this your alter ego? Is this who's talking to me? And he says, you can't beat me. And then he starts doing kind of some mantras and talking and a bit. And Tyson Fury saying he was looking perplexed and saying, what is this I'm dealing with? Is this he was beginning to realize that Deontay Wilder seemed to be suggesting that he was channeling a spirit, or that he was talking to a spirit. It's a fascinating, it's well worth looking at. It's and I believe it to be genuine. And then Fury says, you're already beat. You can't beat me because I have the light of Jesus Christ behind me, and none of you people, and you shouldn't be. I'm going to beat you because I don't like you anymore, because I didn't realize you're dealing with all that spirit stuff. And it's a fascinating, real world example. So those examples prove to me that Tyson Fury understood at the deepest level that spirituality is a real force, and that he used the real spiritual force. Everything else came on. I haven't heard a similar thing from Jordan Peterson. And so this figure I had behind me, this kind of hermit figure, is conflicted in the current stage because it's not meant to be conflicted. If you notice in a few times as well, that Jordan Peterson has started to wear funny clothes. He's even worn clothes seem to be based on a cartoon character, one color down one side, one color down another side. It seems to be presenting this conflicted image.
Well, he even identified that outfit as sheep and goats, right?
Oh, well, there you go. Yeah, there you go. So for me, there are two male figures that are seen to be strong in different ways, and in many ways, Tyson Fury would accept that he's been a bad role model in loads of things. But in relation to the fundamentals, I would trust Tyson Fury personally more than a very, very intellectual person that doesn't ultimately present spirituality as the key thing, and present what I would call a sociological simulacrum. That's what
interesting. Because I've been thinking a lot about, maybe we'll have you back on and talk about this, about the concept of Christian knighthood, right? Which I think it's been killed out in the culture and in Christianity in particular. And I've been thinking a lot about it recently. You know, in fact, my plan is to maybe today to write a blog post about it. But I think we should talk to you about this at some future time, James, because I think this is, in a way, it seems like a missing piece, because so much of Christianity has been gender neutralized, right? It's been demasculated, and the feminine has been reduced to nothing. I mean, when we think about women priests, for instance, and I don't want to get too far away from crystal, but we think about it, right? And the reason I never liked the idea is because it's unisex. It's not male or female. It's neither flesh nor fish, right? And that's why Alison Milbank wrote a wonderful essay for Jesus' Imagination on, and she's a Anglican priest, where she says she prefers the term priestess, but it makes all the other priests in the Anglican communion nuts to talk about it. But she wrote this essay about the feminine charisms of priesthood, which I thought was brilliant. And it was not until that moment that I understood what that could even mean, because it had always been neutralized into this asexual no man and no woman's land, right? And I think I think the idea of a Christian knighthood in this postmodern context, whatever that means, is something that we need to think about again.
Yeah, I think again, going back to what we've talked about before, and again, it applies to men and women, the anima and the animus, as we know. And Saint Michael figure. Michael is a key representation of, and the interesting thing, of course, is about why does he have a sword and the nature of the sword, and I would argue that this is a sword of light, a sword of discernment. It's about the disciplined aspect necessary to understand the world, firstly, because whatever struggle in the future, it's not going to be as it was in the last century. It's about an intellectual. There's an intellectual element to it, and a spiritual element that's associated. That's important. And again, Bridget keeps coming up for me. It's interesting. I was looking at the etymology of the word bride, and again, it's they can't be certain. They often put it down to Germanic languages, knowing a little bit more about them. Now, I'm not as convinced about that, and I'm a bit curious about whether actually it was linked to Bridget and bride, as she was called in England, although Spencer talks Bridget and bride. And also as I've said before, Bridewell, the spire there was used for cakes, and I was wondering, well, why did they think of bride, and what's the connection? And then in mysticism, you have the bride and the bridegroom in relation to the unison. So of course, it's in many senses, being the bride is a strange, for men seems to be a strange kind of contradiction in relation to the mystical thing. But it implies that, for me, that the notion of a bride was a bigger thing about the coming together, which is about, this is what all this relationship is about. It's about getting the balance between two different aspects and getting that right, and allowing the strengths of both, or they're not going to work. So they can't avoid each other. One last point, when you're talking about there is one contradiction in relation to the feminist approach or conceptions of the feminine. It seems to me that some of the most radical transhumanists are feminists, are women. There's many who are driving it, and associated with that seems to be a kind of a strong contempt for traditional feminine values. So it is the idea that traditional feminine values are going to translate or going to stop some of the movements is certainly not justified by looking
Same thing with the masculine, right? Yeah, everybody's going to these traditional ones, right?
Well, I mean, in fact, I pointed to it in that essay on transhumanism. This is an old essay from the early '80s by Donna Jean Haraway, right? The cyborg, which absolute contempt for the feminine.
Yeah.
Both the divine feminine and the human feminine.
People with contempt for the feminine, but also kind of not an antiquated, but a different type of feminism. Because I was thinking, James, when you were talking about Saint Michael, that this week in for my position with the church, I got an email coming from the cathedral, and I appreciate them trying to do something. So, for example, addiction to pornography is ubiquitous on campus, And so I was glad to see it. It was an initiative that came out of the cathedral, but it was a flyer, and it had Saint Michael with his sword. And you got a sense that they needed 300 warriors, and they were just going to slay this demon if men could come together. And I thought of like Jordan Peterson a little bit. And, all these, as we all agree, would need a lot of nuancing. But I also thought of the Promise Keepers movement, if you remember that from some years ago, which was kind of like in America, men would go to a football stadium, get really pumped up and say, like, we're going to be faithful to our wives, we're going to love them. And then they would go home, and it seemed to me that they'd play act being really kind to their wife so they could go back to the football stadium and go like, rah, rah, rah. And again, the pornography thing, talking to so many young men who are completely, addicted, it's probably not going to be beaten with that sword form of Saint Michael. It's going to be beaten with light, bringing light to darkness, and the whole notion of crystals making light, but also coming from the earth, that's a Sophia piece, a light in darkness. And then again, I just wonder, when we use the term good luck charm, some of those I would believe traditionally would be crystals. And charm, again, I don't know the etymology, but I think Tomberg presents charm as the healthy blend between the masculine and the feminine. So many of these men's movements, whether I kind of smelled it from this new initiative coming out, fighting a good battle against pornography, whether Jordan Peterson, whether some of this other stuff. A lot of these men who are trying to find themselves, whether they're going back to old models, but it's decidedly not charming. You can talk to the young women at campus. They see these men who are trying to pull it together by bonding with other men, and we're men. I'm grateful they're vowing to treat me nice, but they're not charming. It doesn't like turn the ladies on that much, and they think the men are kind of play acting and so forth. But a lot of this has been, running through my mind.
Well, my belief is that the only way we can go is to emerge from the chrysalis finally. That the implication of spiritual evolution is that we actually change. Or if we stay in the chrysalis, we'll just fester into some goo, and I think that's what's happening. So implicit in this is a sense that we actually evolve, and in that evolution, we really have to take on board some of the things that we didn't do right or whatever as groups. I'm not in favor of kind of collective responsibility, especially from a legal context, outlawed in a number of contexts. The way different groups or blame is attributed to particular groups. I was quite convinced when I was reading Camilla Paglia in relation to her interpretation about that we're at a particular period in time, and there was very strong role definition, and she looked at the Italian context, and that really this is the problem I had with discussions about patriarchy, the implication that all the men were having a great time or something, when really men and women suffered equally, and in many cases men suffered much worse than at the lower level. And at the top level, if you go back to the period I'm talking about, the Plantagenets and things like that, there was very strong women who had very particular power. And in fact, the founder of the Countess of Anjou was a woman who they believed was a demon as well, which is another interesting element to it. So that we have to really have a complex idea, an open-minded idea, under the understanding that everybody is going to lose if we don't allow appropriate models. And yes, I agree with you that a lot of things look unattractive, and that the nature of the society that we lived in, it doesn't call for the same values in the same way as existed before. And it's the other thing that's been in my mind, I mentioned this before as well, that in many senses the Christian message seems to be predicated to an agricultural society. And when an agricultural society changes, the Christian message in some way doesn't speak in the same way. And there may be written into the Christian message this point of the turning, that this is a point of the turning, and this is as it's meant to be in the unfolding of time. And in that is a necessary redefinition. And the crystal thing, what the message of the crystal thing is, that we have to escape from concentration on the form and the vessel to concentrate on the higher dimension, spiritual identity, and the light that shines through us.
Fascinating. Crystals, who knew? Let me take this almost from I'm still thinking of the beginning of this podcast. We're all often running so fast on the machine to crystals. How about young people's fascination with crystals? If you were, so I didn't know all that much about him, and I just, prior to the podcast, Googled a little bit, again, connecting with my own interest in Ivan Illich, his study of crystallography, but also putting in the term. Michael mentioned the 70s and 80s, but crystals apparently to the online magazines are just huge again, right? For calming, for use, in meditation and so forth. You've been reading into crystals. You're a spiritual disciple. For people who, I think, sophiology too. This notion, I'm thinking of Novalis, right? There's this great scene of, Henry von Orpington, where, he just goes into the subterranean. There's a library, and just all the light because of crystals and gemstones, and these are some wonderful images. So at the pop culture level, James, is there something to be gleaned from crystals? Can we say, like so often we do, that, when swing dancing came back some years ago, young people grabbed something And they said, oh, they're just grabbing something from the past and they're not being innovative. But by and large, it was a good thing. Or again, in some of this gender stuff, if men are fighting pornography, even in this way that might not be charming, I'm still going to say it's a force for good at this time. We've got to try something. So pop culture's fascination with crystals, what's good, what's bad, what should we look out for? And is there a practice that you would recommend?
There's been a major industry which has grown up recently through TikTok in relation to crystals. So a lot of young people are very much into crystals. What I would say, taking a sophiological perhaps view associated with the nature of Celtic Christianity, is that most of these crystals, I'm not making any big social point, but most of these crystals are dug out of the ground by very poor people in Madagascar and places like that, in horrendous conditions, by children and all that. So I don't have a great perspective on that, unfortunately, and the people won't tell you really where they come from. So I'm not a great fan, although I'm very into crystals. I'm not a great fan of the current mass merchandising of crystals. What I would say to people, and to younger people, is if you try and understand what a crystal is, a base, and what the sign of the crystal, because Burma was another one that crystals were important for. And of course, he had mercury, sulfur, and salt in the middle as the balance between them. So, and a particular type of salt, a kind of everlasting salt. So we have this middle road again, which is associated, of course, the Philosopher's Stone. But what I would say is that if you learn to understand about the crystals in your body, for example, earthing, connection with the earth is very useful technique, walking barefoot. And the man who described our body as the hydrated liquid crystal was also the one behind the earthing movement. So this was, the idea is that since we wear rubber-soled shoes and all that, we lose our connection with the earth. And that electrons go through the body and the resonance of the earth goes through your body and it heals inflammation. He says, for example, I don't know, I've never tried it, that if you suffer from jet lag, if you walk on the ground for 15 minutes, it will cure it because it will reestablish your connection with the earth. I don't know if that's true, but I do believe in the earth. And one thing I noticed, we took the kids to Australia and New Zealand for about 3 months, lived in a tent and traveled around, which was great. And lying on the earth for that long develops your intuition. You don't have to do anything, but it certainly sets your body through that contact. So if we begin to understand like that sugar and salt and all those things around it, there are crystals, and we begin to look at the ordinary crystals. Now, I think there's something here about the ordinariness, and this is about the sacramentalness of the ordinary things, why salt is so important, or why sugar is recurrent, or we begin to look at the ordinary sense of crystals, or we begin to ice crystals, as mentioned. That's really the younger person or older person will gain more from those things. There is a danger as well associated with crystals, and that has to be considered. That if all the spiritual traditions say that the crystals can be utilized for interdimensional communication, then there is a slight suggestion that if used in an inappropriate way, that they may kind of open up your perception to things that you don't want to open up to. I'm not saying that that's necessarily true. So there's always crystals around in your environment. So I'd get to know the ones that have the genus loci, the ones that are in your environment, if there's quartz in your environment, etc., that there's a reason why they're there, and the resonance is important. So in their natural state, in their natural condition, getting to know them, I think is good. But certainly, I mean, if they give people help and they help relax them as they can do, or they increase their insight, or their beauty.
And again, maybe we could, maybe we could make a distinction, and I think it'll be loose, but like somebody saying, I read about a crystal online on Vox, and it said, if I order this crystal and it's mined from Mozambique and I get it, it'll help me get this guy or something. As opposed to what you're saying, getting to know the crystals in your environment. That gets back to that primary distinction you're making between crystals, light coming through crystals. And
a lot of them are used. they make these rollers to roll on your skin, to keep yourself young and beautiful. And they make all these claims and all
Yes,
this,
I use it every day.
exploit the, so there's all this value added. There's I would say to people that really, if you look at a lot of motifs in spiritual literature, they're associated with crystals. And the peacock's feather, for example, comes up in a whole load. Now, the peacock's feather is based on photonic crystals. So why are they so attractive? They're so attractive because of the way the light shines through them. So the same with opals, opalescence, pearlescent.
Right.
It's not necessarily about the material subject. It's that they reveal the intricacies of the light that comes through it, as the X-rays light reveals the structure of something else. So it's this connection, which is, again, in the Sermon on the Mount, the crystals, and we have the light. So in the reflection, in many ways, is meant to show us or point us to the light, to the bigger fact. In fact, it points many scientists. So Robert Boyle, for example, learns about luminescence through finding a chicken which had gone bad and was glowing in the dark because of the bacteria. So light is a signal provided. There is a divine path of light that scientists can travel. It will lead scientists, but it also leads the spiritual element of us. And they can come to profound conclusions by following the clues which are provided. They all go back to light. These are all reflections of light.
That's the golden thread, right?
Yeah. The ruby laser, it's about light. So it keeps
Yellow Brick Road.
Sorry?
The Yellow Brick Road, even, right? Of
Now,
the Wizard of Oz.
Let me ask you this, James. We're probably getting toward the end there. So a friend of mine gave me the solution of solar silica, which I started taking diluted in water, and which I mean, one of the things he said is that, this, I mean, and we do know that this silica cleans toxins from the system, right? And also, say you got some kind of shot over the last few years, and there might be something not good in there, that this might clean it out, right? Not that I've had that kind of procedure happen to me. No way. And we also, I mean, another thing we use in biodynamic farming is horsetail, which is loaded with silica, a natural forming vegetable form of silica, which is used. We use it to decrease mold and fungal diseases and stuff like this, right? Which, if you apply that to the human body, right, it's parasites, right? So, do you know anything about that, James? Would you say anything about that? Bringing it into our bodies?
Yes. The most likely technology for transhumanists, mass transhumanists, network transhumanists, clandestinely or surreptitiously, apart from healing the sick as they intend to do, is by ingestion or inhalation of nanoparticles, which are composed of effectively self-assembling crystalline structures. And that's where graphene is important. And there's plenty of literature about that. So they'll be able to put into your body, and this is what they're talking about, Yuval Noah Harari, or we can see in your body. Yeah. As they insert, if imagine there's some bad people like in this dark crystal, and they want to see what you're thinking, they can insert this thing which will shine in certain lights, and we can penetrate your consciousness according to them. So that possibility is there because it's in the literature, it's in the scientific literature. They already have the capacity to have endovascular chemicals which bind with the neurons and will be able to send signals or be used as conductors. And there's this new hydrogel that was announced this week, partly built in the town that I'm talking about.
No kidding.
Which they will be able to insert in the brain and act as a conductor. So all that stuff is there. So the point that I would, and I'm going to argue from now on, one of the points is that what we need to do is to encourage the scientific community as well, the good guys there, to begin to develop countermeasures to the possibility of abuse of mass public health measures intended or calculated to insert alien bodies into the human, possibly on some spurious public health ground, which seems to be the mission. They have decided to do so. And remember that J.D. Bernal, who worked on graphite, the precursor of graphene, said that we would, the humans would be transformed into silicon. You're maybe on the way there, transformed into silicon. And the ones that didn't do it would live in a human zoo, and they would be experimented upon by the scientists whose curiosity would outweigh their humanity. This is what he said. There is a very Marquis de Sade element to this. The future, as far as I can see in scientocracy, is sadistic. There's a deep sadism there associated with the denial of humanity, the body, embodiment, incarnation, etc.
Totally.
Yeah. So it's in the literature. The last point, just to worth thinking about. There's a lot of fascination with insects. You may have heard recently about consuming.
We've been talking about it a lot here. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, people are concerned about the the health ramifications, but I don't think it's the biggest concern. My biggest concern, now again, there's a crystalline structure associated with this chitin, whatever you want, chitin we call it in the Greek. So chitin, that's the shell of insects and that. This is the crucial thing. What does the scientific literature say about the reason why they're using chitin? What is the recent state-of-the-art, internationally refereed public journals saying about this substance? They say that chitin is an ideal subject or an ideal base for tissue engineering, to create a scaffold for tissue engineering, because it binds as a whatever it is, polysaccharide, it binds with other things in the body, other substances in the body. If you take the view, just an interesting thought, Gedanken experiment, if you take what the scientists have said, now I like, as opposed to speculation or conspiracy theories, I like to quote the scientists themselves. Well, we know that H.G. Wells said there's going to be a new world order run by scientists in his book, The New World Order. And he said it was an open conspiracy for the conspiracy. That's the name of the book. And he was associated with...
We're just reporting the facts, people.
And J.D. Bernal said they would perform experiments, and he was
doing really good. We're just letting you
things.
know.
And his friend was studying, guess what his friend Ashbury was studying? He was studying chitin.
Wow.
The same circle. So these things are consistent.
Yeah.
So now we have a situation where if one believed what they said and believed that you could perform surreptitious and clandestine experiments on a mass scale, and that they have the technology, according to the scientific literature, to insert in the body something that can be used as a scaffolding, it would mean that in strange situations that they could transform the existing human body without the person's will, and so you have this a lot of people doing strange things to their bodies. It won't look so strange then if you get an alien figure who develops that way naturally because of the things that have been inserted into their body, so that there can be experiment. And that's because this stuff is indigestible. Now my concern is if this stuff is in the body and it can bind, it's an ideal binding agent. The way insects and animals use this is it's very flexible. It's like cellulose, and it can be used as a building block to build whatever you want. So they've said they're building back better. They've said they want to be able to program the body. If you look at chitin, if you look at graphene,
how is chitin spelled?
C-H-I-T-I-N.
I just didn't know that word. I'll be honest.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's what makes the
critical.
exoskeleton.
If you look at them and put them together and what they have said, well, then they have the opportunity to experiment. Now, of course, you would say, well, all those good people wouldn't do that. Unfortunately,
yes, they would.
They have told us they were going to do it, and they've acted utterly consistently. So when people are seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, I'm afraid they haven't really read what these guys are saying. And when you have centralized into a bio-directorate in the World Health Organization, this was the basis of world governance in the bio-directorate for H.G. Wells in the New World Order. So now it's upon us. We have changed this. They will change your state. They will change the state, the political state you live in, and change the state of the world. That is what they have said. Everything they have done is utterly consistent with that. So there's another good reason. Now, I don't want to say that to make people depressed, but really, unfortunately, we have to look at the possibility of abuse that's there consistent with what they have described to do. Now, the good point about that is when you begin to see really what it entails about the end of humanity, then you begin to understand what the value of the Christian message. Islam has the same concept of light shining and us being reflections of light. It's in all the spiritual traditions, lightness in Buddhism. It's a universal aspect of perennial thought that once we realize that this is who we are, that the enlightening process is a spiritual process first and foremost that has been taken by the Enlightenment and presented in an alternative simulacrum, that we'll be able to then understand through the contrast what the choices are. And
Christ and Antichrist. James Tunney, what a tour de force. We're off and running. A couple things about you, is the fact that you've kind of like you would kind of tie into some of our previous programming. When people are watching you on YouTube, you're writing down things for questions. You have a lot of information, but there's a wild courtesy that comes from the way you do what you do, and I find it compelling, and I'm very grateful for it. Plantation of the Automatons, you mentioned that's on my read list, but I'm moving it up to like the next thing I read. Tell people about how they can get in touch with your works and things like that.
I have a website, jamestunney.com, I think it's called, and you see the stuff there. And Plantation of the Automatons is the big one. And plants, of course, they operate photosynthesis by minerals, and biomineralization is critical. Again, without rehearsing all, it's true plants that came to insights about liquid crystals. We're talking through them liquid crystals now. The reason what's happening now is that around the world there are new families being organized of intellectual, spiritual affiliations, and this is what we have to do, and that's why we have to pay attention to each other to gain insights and to begin to talk in an open way. Or I call it the mystic murmuration. Recently, I've been talking about creating a peaceful, invisible army. If people have a robust view of what's happening, I'm against the idea that can be solved by any organization. They're always subject to take over. But if people are informed, they can act in their own sphere, in their own way, and contribute. And in the Christian way about dividing families, I see that as a description of what's going to happen if people don't adopt a spiritual path. That inevitably, even if it's in our own family, that we will end up splitting, because there will be no choice. There has to be a commitment, and that's in all the Marian apparitions as well, as we know. One last point as well, sorry, but if you look at where most Marian apparitions happened, now you could say Italy, but France is the real big one, and France is also the place that has most battles in human history, and I think that connection is not an accidental connection.
They even say Medjugorje was, right near the site of where I think Croatians were murdered by Serbs or vice versa in World War II and so forth. Yeah, there's all these things.
Connection is this duality and this suggestion about this split and the necessity to reconcile.
Amen.
So thank you, and thanks for your work. I think it's appreciated, and I think
thanks for your work. And I hope it doesn't sound presumptuous if we call you a friend and say, like, I hope people who are listening to the Regeneration podcast know that we're going to have James Tunney on again, and hopefully somewhat regularly. So thanks for all your work, and thanks everybody.
Thanks Michael as well, for both Michaels.
Yeah.
for your questions and observations. And
Right.
hope I didn't bang on too long there.
No.
No.
With the right
Wonderful.
people.
All right. Thanks everybody for listening to the Regeneration Podcast. We'll see you again next week.